All right, welcome back, everybody. We're at the this is the third session of the first module. So yeah, so Reza's back and connected. So we'll pass it to Reza and we'll begin.
Excellent. So before starting today's session, is there any question, discussion, talk about the stuff that we were talking about in the previous two sessions? Anything?
I've been reading quite a bit of Wimsat and
Which ones?
went down the path of, well, I read Re-engineering Philosophy for Limited Beings, I think that's what it is, and then went down the kind of like generative entrenchment path. So it took me out of the book into a couple of his papers where he talks about scaffolds.
Yes.
And scaffolding culture, and then kind of evolutionary development takes.
Yes, I have read that. Okay.
And culture, and I was just curious to know whether this notion of scaffolds might be linked to what you were saying about platforms.
Platform. Yes, scaffolding is platform. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Cool.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, Wimsat is, I think, a really great, philosopher of science, and it has actually contributed, to this kind of revolution in modeling, that piecewise model. The thing about him, if you have, I think the one that you have read is the one on cultural scaffolding, and he talks. It kind of like, basically, that paper is kind of like a critique of the linguistic term in cultural development. When people talk about these kinds of things from a kind of a Darwinian position about the scaffolding and entrenchment, it's very easy for them to dismiss basically the centrality of language in culture formation. In fact, as being the de facto platform for cultural formation, precisely because they see language simply as some sort of ordinary language, or the kind of see it through the lens of traditional philosophy of language, which is like a more or less as credible as, or as sophisticated as, classical logic. It's quite very, very, has classical rules, classical sense of what language is, so on and so forth. But the thing is that, and this is something that we will talk about in the third module, that once you see language as this manifold of hierarchies, syntax, semantics, pragmatics, and whether it is natural language or formal language, a theoretical language, artificial language, it's then you see that precisely that it's impossible to have actually any kind of social or cultural formation without the cognitive tools provided by these syntactic, semantic, pragmatic levels of language. And deep down, language is nothing but really this super vast computational system, which is, absolutely is essential. It's completely unimaginable to think of any complex cognitive capacity without language capacity, precisely because language capacity is has not only, it has different levels of complexity, but also has basically integrates different models of computation, and not all of these models of computation, the paradigms of computation, doing computing, are not are available to the kind of structural functional picture that, for example, Wimsat talks about. Usually all of these people who talk about kind of a neo-Darwinian turn to complexity sciences, or the kind of a computational equivalent of it. By computation, all they mean is simply effective computability, Turing-Church thesis. But the whole point is that language is not just that. Language actually has different models of computation, and only at the level of the syntax is basically you can model it via Turing-Church thesis. And this is something that, we will get to this, at the end of the second module, and the third module will be this, which brings us back to this that I talked about, that ultimately we want to investigate is basically the deep picture of cognition. We want to provide a computational hermeneutic of sapiens cognition as a deep object, basically, as a logically, computationally deep object. So yes, I will talk about this deep object a little bit today. Yes, so yeah, so just wanted to make this comment about WIMSAT, and kind of which I talked about it in the last session. When people talk about computation and stuff, about hierarchies, there are extremely strong theses and very, very powerful in terms of thinking the scope of some kind of like large formations. But nevertheless, they have themselves both methodological and metaphysical biases.
Mm-hmm.
Bias is not in a positive sense, in a completely negative sense.
The one that I read was with James Grisimer.
Yes.
It's called Reproducing Entrenchments to Scaffold Culture, the Central
Yes.
Role of Development in Cultural Evolution.
Yes, he has I think a collection of essays. He edited a collection of essays. It's called The Scaffolding Something. It's actually quite a very interesting book. It's really, really expensive though. If you can find it somewhere online, that would be great.
Okay, I'll have a look. I'll see what I can do.
I have a scanned version of that. I just need to upload it. It's probably like 200 megabytes.
Oh yeah, the MIT Press one.
Yes, that's the one.
Okay.
So, if language is one example here of a platform or a scaffold, but would there be another sort of ready example like that of a platform within sort of a hierarchy of complex systems?
I think, nervous system neurulation processes can also be taken as platforms. And this is a really good book on this, is Renaissance Structural Stability and Morphogenesis. It's like at the middle of the book, he talks about basically neurulation processes and the emergence of the nervous system. And this is actually really interesting that basically, yes, the nervous system is really like this platform, not only for cognition, but also for organogenesis, basically, of the entire body. And once the nervous system generates, via these neurulation processes, it's basically, as I said, it reduces the diversity of the organogenesis. Nevertheless, it basically adds to the complexity of the organs. Basically, organs becomes highly specialized. But their diversity starts to flatten out. And this is, we see this basically in the kind of a transition of, rudimentary, for example, nervous system to kind of complex nervous system that is not simply a kind of parochial differential responsiveness to stimuli, but it actually, plays the role of anticipation, forecasting, a statistical inference of environmental data, so on and so forth. But also another great thing is that Son makes this speculation somewhere toward the end of the book that basically language starts basically.
Reza, what
Yes.
book are you talking about?
It's a Structural Stability and Morphogenesis by René Thom.
Thank you.
Yes, so he talks about this when basically the capacity of the nervous system as a platform starts to diminish in terms of basically scaffolding these complex additions. That's where exactly language starts, and he makes a really fantastic kind of like a neuroscientific speculation about the origin of language and how basically language needs to be understood as a platform that tops basically the nervous system, precisely because the nervous system at that point, in terms of basically the organogenesis, it's a scaffolding function for organogenesis. Basically, its capacity bottoms out. And language is basically the one platform that covers this and kind of increases its capacities that itself cannot afford. There are other examples. I mean, we can see a scaffolding in a lot of phenomena. I mean,
biologically, I was wondering about the role of something like the cell. Once you get the cell wall, that I was wondering if that's something. But the interesting thing about the nervous system is the way that it connects different functions and then allows differentiation. I'm not sure.
Yes, and a specialization of functions. Yes, I think with the cell, we can talk about this, but I think a scaffolding is usually, as you said, it's not a unit. It's an interaction between some scaffolding processes that basically create a stabilized structure and canalization of basically functions, canalization of differential structures. Probably, I mean, I need to think about this, whether cell can be called, I mean, if that's the case, then we can say that a gene also is a scaffold,
Right, but it's sort of a different scale, right? So
yes, that's the whole
describing it now. Like maybe you could treat the cell as a platform, but only at a sort of cell level.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. That genes, probably. I mean, I think that genes are platforms, but that's the whole point. That scaffolds needs to be understood within their own hierarchy. We can't extend that. And that's precisely, that's so many people like Dawkins overextend the platform of the gene.
I guess the other thing is, sorry, there's the nervous system, which is a really interesting example. Then there's also the skin, where that's very much like a shared, I don't know, service for all the sort of systems within the body, or like is that just another organ that's specialized, or is there some?
Skin is usually considered to be an organ, yes, and it is, and this is one of the things that actually. Are you familiar with Alan Berthaud, Brain Sense of Movement? You should definitely check. Everyone should read this book. It's one of the best books really on on brain and nervous system. Brain system. Skin, yes, it talks about this, in terms of muscular threshold and also skin. as basically, and this is also the Renaissance theory, that they are specialized by nervous system. The way that we see them in human function or in a kind of mammalian complex functions. In fact, the skin, I mean, we can see it. So many of our, basically, one of the primary motivations, computational motivations behind evolution of the nervous system was simply a spatial differentiation. Basically, the organism should tell the difference between itself, its food, and predator. The thing is that, as basically this nervous system, emerge, it supplements, basically, it supplies the organism with more sophisticated means of a spatial differentiation. Not only in terms of simple, responsiveness, differentiation of a stimuli and, self-contrastation of organism with the environment, but simply proactively explore a space, kind of in the kind of a very Kantian sense of a spatial awareness, the outer sense, what Kant calls outer sense. The thing is that a skin actually plays a huge role in a spatial differentiation. In terms of heat dynamics, for example, if you get something, before even your eyes can detect it, if heat comes to your forehead, you can detect it. These are extremely sensitive. Basically, skin is extremely sensitive to a spatial coordination, and actually has a strong coupling with the sense of gravity, in fact, like inner ear. Inner ear and the skin, these are very basically adapted to detection of, for example, continuity versus inertia versus discontinuity by way of a sense of gravity. Hence, creating different, basically, orientational cues for the organism.
Thanks.
The other thing that came out of the scaffolds thing for me was, I think maybe a particular class of scaffolds or something, where at least he talks about bundling or sequestration, where I think you deliver inside this bundle a set of materials, but also it's the organization. And has to do with like modularity as well.
Yes, we will talk about this today. Yes, it's
Cool.
it's different. It's different.
Excited.
Yes, it's different. Basically, the whole notion of bundling is basically different types of modularity. Vertical, horizontal, spatial modularities. Yes.
Cool.
It seems that Estefan has the Berthaud's book. If he can share, that would be great. I have it. Unfortunately, I need to spend time to scan that book, and that book is really, for some reason, is out of publication for a long time, and the price has gone up on the used like to $2,000.
Which one?
Alan Berthaud, Brain Sense of Movement. He's actually Berthaud. He's not a neuroscience philosopher. He is actually a neuroscientist. Another person, if you want to look more into these kinds of, biological coupling with complexity sciences and stuff, Stanislas Dehaene. He's also a great writer. Is also a neuroscientist. He has written some really great books in terms of specialization, functional specialization in nervous system, particularly in relation to basically primate mathematical arithmetic capacities, basically, like dead reckoning, counting, tying knots, so on and so forth. Okay, so sorry, I'm a little bit coughing. Okay, so if you remember, we had this list of basically main features of complex systems. Now, before moving to the measures of complexity, which I'm going not to talk about all measures of complexity. I'm going to talk about only three. One of them today at the end. The concept of logical depth, and then I reserve the two others, the statistical complexity and basically algorithmic computational complexity for next session, and hopefully we will have time also to discuss some model examples, as I promised. If we don't have, if basically just extends, it's okay. We will just use it in the second module and discuss them. I don't think that we have any problem with regard to time. So I'm going to talk about the main features, some of the main features of complexities that I listed, and I very, very briefly talked about, I think, in the first session. I'm going to share the slides. Okay. And also, I have not forgotten that I promised to talk about Boltzmann conception of time and how it radically, almost rapidly, can basically overthrow all of these basically stuff that we have been arguing, the majority of them. Not only are basically complexity theories, but also really at fundamental level, ways, methodologies of modern physics, observation, theories of causality, so on and so forth. I will try to either today or next session, talk about Boltzmann a little bit. So. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So now complex systems, are systems that constitute, basically, as I said, basically. Any of these, features, but the whole thing is that, basically, nonlinear dynamic systems don't essentially manifest all of these properties at the same time. I mean, within this list, roughly, properties on the lower, of this list are particularly, exclusive to basically a living phenomenon, biological phenomenon, and we probably can't really, observe them within, other kinds of physical complex systems. So what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to list these, talk about these, and after talking about them, I will move to basically to kind of as I said, the kind of like the to discussion, why is that these basically features are important, and via what kind of measure or characterization are we able to detect these features in systems. And that's basically our point of entry to theories about measures of complexity, starting with fundamental of Boltzmann informational entropic content of a system, and then moving to basically Bennett's logical depth. So the diversity and domain specificity of these properties explains the diversity of the notions of complexity, self-organization, etc. And the challenges to understanding that these properties continue to pose reduces basically any hope for a unified account of complexity domain in the near future. Just as there is no canonical list of complex system properties, many of these terms have no canonical definition either. Nevertheless, I'm going to give a kind of like a brief survey of these properties. We kind of like detailed about nonlinear interactions and non-additivity in the first session, so I'm going to skip this one. For irreversibility, a process that is reversible can also be run backwards while still satisfying the same laws. Classical dynamics is time reversible in this sense. Every dynamically possible process running forward is equally possible running backwards. But virtually all processes are dissipative. The energy they degrade in quality and shed as waste during the process cannot be retrieved. And this is one of the basic characteristics of complex systems, because it is converted to heat and distributed randomly throughout the universe, so that they cannot be run in reverse. They also will not persist unless a supply of sufficiently high quality energy, typically in requisite material forms, is available to continually renew their dissipative processes. Therefore, they are inherently open systems. Here, only very small brief changes may be approximately reversible, a condition especially obtaining near a dynamical equilibrium. Many, but of course not all, examples of complex dynamics, but all those concerned with living systems can be characterized as irreversible systems. Now, the third one is constraints. We are going to basically, when we are talking about complex systems, this concept of constraint is extremely important. And we need to be very careful to distinguish different contexts of constraints. This is one of them, and then I have listed more down the line. The first one are holonomic and non-holonomic constraints. Constraint on a dynamical process are those limitations on the relationships among its variables that arise from the imposed physical conditions in which the process takes place. Now, this is the definition of the holonomic. A marble rolling in a bowl is confined to the surface of the bowl, whereas a small spacecraft has no such constraints. You can think of like a particle stuck to the surface of a sphere. In contrast, to a particle that falls under, or suspends in gravity, without the constraint of the surface of that sphere. Whereas a small spacecraft has no constraints, though both move under local gravitational forces. A system's effective degree of freedom are those provided by its inherent variabilities, its dynamical variables, minus those removed through constraints. A dynamical explanation consists in deriving the behavior in question from a model of dynamical variable interrelations, constraints, and initial conditions. As the marble rolling without and with friction respectively shows, constraints may apply to both reversible and irreversible processes and are typically required to characterize specific processes, for example, in a cell. Currently, we only form general analytic dynamics, the Lagrangian Hamiltonian dynamics, for systems that do not work on their constraints. The core of these, in turn, is formed by systems also having holonomic constraints, roughly constraints that are purely a matter of space-time geometry and independent of the system's dynamical states and are energy conserving. There are various simple extensions of this core theory, into the non-holonomic, non-conserving domain, but they remain, special cases. Now, it's precisely these features that complex, nonlinear, irreversible systems lack. For example, a river running between sand and gravel banks has non-holonomic constraints. And what are these non-holonomic constraints? The river banks, which it alters through doing work on them and thus dissipating, i.e. not conserving its energy. Similarly, a group of closed self-reproducing processes, for example, cell metabolism, must do work under many constraints in order to recreate them, while many dynamical bifurcations, for example, in boiling phenomena, are initiated in this way. Does anyone have a question?
I'd love to hear a little more about holonomic. I'm not quite getting that.
Okay, holonomic, as I said, it's simply the constraints of a spatiotemporal geometry on systems, basically. As I said, for example, the constraints regarding the position, basically a spatiotemporal position in a quite parochial way, but also you can think about this in terms of, basically the field of space on systems, regardless of basically their internal dynamical states. For example, a particle, a fly on our skin is holonomically constrained by our skin, namely its field of positioning on a spatial field represented by our skin. It's basically very simple. It's just a jargon for, spatial localization constraints.
Is there a way to apply that to language?
No.
Okay.
You can, yes, well, not language, but basically there is, I think a theory, we can develop a theory and talk about the idea that our spatial awareness, perspectival spatial awareness, is objectively under the influence of holonomic constraints. And this is basically, again, one of the fundamental insights of Kant, his theories of intuition of space and time. But not with regard to language as such. Yes, basically the way that in fact we talk about objects, you know, has this kind of implicit, basically, is implicitly, implicitly talks about these holonomic constraints. We can see this in our spatial propositions. For example, if you look at spatial propositions of any language, we have, for example, propositions like on, under, in. These are basically basically talks about holonomic constraints. But we don't want to talk about that because that's also a different kind of. It's not really a holonomic constraints, but nevertheless, yes, we can. I think we can talk about these spatial propositions in terms of spatial constraints. But this has something to do with also with our particularly perspectival consciousness.
Would that include hearing? Would like this be like the aspect of sound related to language? Would that be a holonomic constraint, or is that just kind of?
No.
Okay.
When we talk specifically about physical bodies, basically body systems.
Okay, thanks.
There is a great book. I mean, if you want to look into a little bit more into this kinds of stuff, in terms of how language basically language has, when we look at natural language, it has an element of a naive physics which has been completely unexplored. Very much you can see this naive physics in the spatial propositions of ordinary language. A great book that really explores deeply this problem is Claude Van der Looy, Spatial Propositions, a case study in French. It's a very great book. I can type it here. That's his. This is the spelling of his name. Okay. Back to our list. Can you see the screen, the slides?
Yes.
Okay. So. The next one is equilibria and stabilities. Qualitatively, some aspect A of a dynamical system is in equilibrium if and only if there is no net force acting on the A aspect of the system. Its A forces are in balance, and there are thus no net second order rates of change, namely accelerations in A. Across the range of possible A choices, an important distinction is then drawn between a static and dynamic equilibria. That is, between cases where the time invariance concerns state parameters and variables. A is basically just a system of states, and cases where it concerns process parameters and rate variables, A as system processes. The static equilibria require no energy input or output to persist. For example, a crystal at rest. Dynamical equilibria typically require an irreversible ordered energy, namely negentropy. This is, I will talk about the concept of negentropy later on. So dynamic equilibria typically require an irreversible ordered energy flow to sustain them. For example, water flow to sustain the wave structure of river rapids, together with appropriate waste, degraded or entropic outputs. For example, again, turbulent water. For living systems, there is water, food, and hydrogen-oxygen input flow to sustain them, and heat and chemicals as waste outputs. For these and other dynamically stable systems, energy material flows act to stabilize the system processes so that for small disturbances that do not affect the underlying flows, these systems will behave as if they have a statistic equilibria in these flow variables. In other respects, however, such as river flows acting on river banks and metabolism producing cellular aging, the system may do work that alters and eventually undermines its dynamic equilibria. Now, equilibria of any sort are stable, metastable, or unstable. And when we talk about complex systems, we usually talk about metastability, but I want to talk about all of these categorizations of equilibria. An equilibria, in some aspect A, is stable with respect to some class of disturbances, namely perturbations D, if and only if its response to any disturbance from D, the perturbance, is to soon return to its original A condition under its own dynamical processes and remain there. An equilibrium is unstable to a class D of disturbances if it does not return near to its original A condition, and it is metastable to D if it is stable for some disturbances from D and unstable for others. Now this is an important one. The closed set of states as a system repeatedly traverses when at equilibrium is its attractor. For example, the marble's rest point is a point attractor. If it circled frictionlessly around that point, but up to a basin wall, it would be a cyclic attractor. And the wider set of states it can pass through while returning to its attractor is its attractor basin. Basically, the bowl provides a literal attractor basin. And this is a diagram of this is also people who are familiar with glass bead collective. That's basically the picture on their website, and this basically a picture of this, a diagram of this has been provided in by Ren and Thom. A complex dynamics may generate several different equilibria of various stabilities, attractor basins of various shapes, either directly intersecting or connected by transient paths, where small disturbances may change its destination. Rolling on a horizontal surface in our bowl example, plus other transient paths that do not end. This attractor landscape is a system's dynamical signature, basically expressing its dynamical form. A system that remains within a single attractor landscape is structurally stable, meaning its autonomous dynamics in mathematical, language, mathematical theory, and otherwise is structurally meta or unstable. Now, while mathematical dynamics typically assume a structural stability, many complex systems are structurally unstable, i.e., they bifurcate in mathematical, parlance, exhibiting phase changes. That's the whole idea of basically phase change. I think the best way of understanding this, how equilibria and stabilities work in terms of, a stable, metastable, unstable, is really looking into a couple of phenomena. For example, fluvial dynamics. As I said, the river flow in banks and landscape formation. The idea that basically rivers under the gravity move towards sea, and as they move, basically according to these attractors and these various schemas of equilibria, they basically form different kinds of landscapes, and this whole landscape again constrains the river flow and then creates more differentiation. And you can see this same kind of processes via these equilibria, stabilities, holonomic constraints, basically in organogenesis, differentiation of organs, emergence of different organs in the body of an organism. And the best book, as I said, about this is really Thumb's Structural Stability. The next one is amplification. Transient paths aside, a disturbance to a system at equilibrium will have one of three consequences. Leave it within its current attractor basin, push it into another attractor basin, or transform the attractor landscape, leaving the system in an attractor basin in the new landscape. Now, in the first case, the disturbance will be suppressed, negatively amplified, namely amplified down, as the system returns near to its original state. In the other two cases, the disturbance will be augmented, positively amplified, as the system departs from its original state. Now, the thing is that amplification is really the norm of almost all nonlinear systems. We talked about sensitivity to initial conditions, again, in detail, so I'm going to skim over this one. But I think it's good to talk about this also a little bit about sensitivity to initial conditions in relation to this ideas of attractor and amplification. So just very briefly, as we talked about, non-linearities in dynamical systems, permit small differences in system state to be amplified into large differences in subsequent system trajectory. Now, this was basically the whole idea of sensitivity to initial conditions. For example, a system may be poised near the threshold of changing either attractor basin within the same landscape or changing landscape, so that a small disturbance is amplified to produce a larger change. Again, you can think of this very intuitively in terms of the river flow and how it basically makes landscapes around itself. And while systems left by disturbances inside the same attractor basin are insensitive to initial conditions in respect of their ultimate destination, they may still be locally sensitive to the path taken back to the equilibrium attractor. Sensitivity to initial conditions is as common as amplification, but under certain conditions, it takes a special form where a strange attractor is formed in which motion is said to be chaotic because it occurs at random. However, the motion remains deterministic and far from being more disordered than a normal attractor, is best viewed as superordered, since every point within it may manifest sensitivity to initial conditions. Now, we talked about that this randomness is confined to trajectory locations sampled across the attractor and the like. We talked about this a little bit in terms of, when we were talking about the positive global Lyapunov exponent. The next one, the next feature of complex systems is finite deterministic unpredictability. Roughly, systems manifesting sensitivity to initial conditions present the problem that the small uncertainties, including errors, and we talked about this, errors can be basically measurement observational errors, in initial conditions may be amplified into large subsequent uncertainties in system location and trajectory. That is, system predictability is limited by knowledge of initial conditions, and that was one of the main characteristics that we attributed to complex systems. How severe a limitation this is in practice, and in what respect, depends basically on the amplification processes involved. In particular, while prediction that a system's state will remain within a strange attractor is often legitimate, knowledge of location within the attractor can be quickly lost, but not always. Conversely, since systems showing sensitivity to initial conditions can be significantly influenced using only small signals or disturbances, then so long as the relevant state conditions can be distinguished, these conditions can be used to sensitively guide or control them. Symmetry breaking. I remember that I suggested a good book on symmetry breaking is Francois Bailly and Giuseppe Longo's Mathematics in Natural Sciences, Physical Singularity of Life. I think he has also another book which is really great on symmetry breaking, which with another person, I have forgotten his name. I think it's Perspectives in Biology is the title of the book. I have forgotten, but you can easily find it, and they are both online. So a symmetry is invariance under an operation. For example, the molecular structure of a cubic crystal is invariant under a spatial shift along any axis. Classical dynamics is invariant under reversal of time. Symmetry breaking occurs when an existing symmetry is disrupted. If water or another fluid is heated from below in a pan, then its previous complete kinetic symmetry, basically same random motion profile of molecules throughout the pan, is broken vertically as layers nearer the bottom heat up while those at the top remain cooler, passing the applied heat upward by conduction. This already changes the dynamical form of the system from a stable dynamic equilibrium maintained by internal molecular collisions producing no net macro force to a stabilized dynamic equilibrium maintained by irreversible vertical transmission of heat, or in this case, as a kinetic energy. If the applied heat is increased, there comes a point where rolling boiling, this formation, sets in. Conduction is replaced by convection, and the fluid breaks up horizontally and vertically into convection cells, each matched to its neighbor along its boundary. You can basically, as a basic experiment, you can use this basically like a chemical class, experimented with different liquids, boiling them, or add a little bit color and see basically how this whole system reforms and basically changes its shape. This change corresponds to the breakdown of previous horizontal symmetry and is again maintained by increased heat flow. In each symmetry breaking, the orderedness and complexity of the system behavior increased. And basically, this is typical in complex systems. Symmetry breaking may be spontaneous, brought about by the system's own dynamics, or imposed, as in the heating example that we just talked about. Now, spontaneous symmetry breaking transitions are assumed to account for all the emergence of order and complexity in the universe since the supersymmetry of the Big Bang. For people who want to, look into this whole idea of symmetry and symmetry breaking more in detail, Hermann Weyl classic book called Symmetry is a really great, introduction to the concept of symmetry and also symmetry breaking. The thing is that, there are, when we are talking about symmetry and invariances, the actual definition of symmetry is much more subtle than what I just gave. There are very actually subtle, basically subtly different concepts of symmetry detection, or basically concepts of invariance. Not all of these concepts involve basically this spatial shift or basically preservation of invariance under some spatiotemporal translation. Again, Hermann Weyl provides a kind of a wide survey of these different concepts of invariance and forms of symmetry. Bifurcation. A bifurcation occurs when a structural instability in a system leads to a change in its dynamical form. That is, a change in the structure of its attractor landscape. Now, there are many dynamically different ways in which this can occur, broadly classified as either local, where the form changes continuously as some dynamical parameters continuously vary, or global changes that involve more complex shifts. Now, among basically the global shifts are phase transitions. For example, gas to liquid, liquid to solid, or reverse, including critical point transitions like simultaneous transitions among gas, liquid, and solid states, so on and so forth, where changes can be discontinuous and uncomputable, essentially because fluctuations on every scale up to that of the whole system are simultaneously possible. Now, while we can study mathematically the conditions under which a bifurcation occurs, beyond the simplest cases, we typically have no dynamical mathematical analysis of the process of the change itself. Rather, the conditions of occurrence are deduced, where possible, by matching of characterizations of the antecedent and subsequent dynamical states in terms of parameter changes across the bifurcation threshold. I think basically, thinking about these main, so far, the listed features of complex systems, these are all intuitive. In fact, we can, as I said, you can think about these, and how basically they work, and whether we can really think about them as such, or actually are basically they are simply can be talked about within a deductive framework in relation to other properties. You can think about them in examples of real life quite intuitively. River change, boiling of water, the convection flow in your oven, so on and so forth. But there are, as we go to those, a little bit more, there are, as I said, are more peculiar to life biological phenomena. They become less intuitive. And so we are moving, more toward those features of complex systems. Self-organization. Self-organization happens when a system bifurcates sufficiently under its own dynamics to a form exhibiting more ordered and more complex behavior. The molecular motion in a heated pan of water shifting from conduction through random collisions to cellular convecting provides a core intuitive example of self-organizing phenomena. By contrast, the reverse bifurcations, as heat is reduced to the water, equally dynamically transforming, would not normally be considered self-organizations. They might be considered self-disorganizations. I will talk about this a little bit once we are done with this, at the end of our session about Hegel notion of Geist, and because we had very briefly talked about it in the classroom in terms of this idea of disorganization and self-organization, which is usually associated with Hegel's Geist as a complex system. So please remind me to talk about this at the end. Now, since the condensing of molten iron to form a solid iron crystal is also considered self-organization, it is clear that self-organization has little to do with organization proper, since an iron crystal is too ordered to be significantly organized. Many self-organized states could also be brought about through external manipulation. For example, it's possible to build up an iron crystal lattice by spraying iron ions a few at a time on a template. So, while the outcome is the same, here the active self is missing. It's basically the whole idea of self-organization. All things considered, it is probably most useful to consider self-organization to occur where and only where a system bifurcates sufficiently under its own dynamics, so as to bring to bear an additional system-wide constraint, or at any rate an additional multi-component that is relatively macro constraint. The formation of a new relatively macro constraint, however brought about, creates a new level proper in the system, since the constraint now filters out more microscopic relation detail incompatible with it. The iron crystal, in our example, filters out thermal fluctuations and many external perturbations, dissipating their energy as lattice vibrations. Otherwise, the constraint would not be stable against microscopic originated perturbations and similar external disturbances. So basically, self-organization has its role in this kind of autonomous stabilization process. We talked about the emergence, so I'm going to skip this one as well. Sorry. Now, as I said, constraints and different conceptions of constraints are very important in complex systems. And this one is especially very, important, and it's usually typically when we are talking about constraints, people usually think about it as a kind of basically a negative limitation. But constraints in complex systems usually, often, but not always, play a role of enablement. Basically, they enable the system. So, the term constraint implies limitation. Most generally, in the basically context of complex system, it refers to limited access to dynamical states. Equivalently, it means reducing basically degrees of freedom by limiting dynamical trajectories to subsets of state space. This is the common disabling sense of the term, basically constraint. But constraints can at the same time also be enabling. They can provide access to new states unavailable to the unconstrained system. Equivalently, by coordinately decreasing degrees of freedom, they provide access to dynamical trajectories inaccessible to the unconstrained system. Thus, for example, a skeleton is a disabling constraint. For example, limiting the movements of limbs. You can think of this in an octopus. But by providing a jointed frame of rigid components for muscular attachments, it also acts to enable a huge range of articulated motions and leverages, transforming an organism's accessible niche, initiating armor and predator-prey races, and so on and so forth. Now, sorry. Each of the great transitions in the evolutionary history, the emergence of multicellular organisms, marks a new coordination of constraints, and this is again a very very precise discussion on enabling role of constraint. Is again in the work of Bailly and Longo, and also Alain Berthaud's brain sense of movement. That basically this whole idea that coordination of constraint is basically the whole idea of this enablement. By permitting reliable cooperation instead of competition and reliable inheritance of the fruits of cooperation, the new coordinations created new complexity and opened up vast new possibilities. Coordinated constraint can work their way around physical laws, basically. For example, while no single pump can lift water higher than 10 meters, trees lifted many times this by physically linking together, coordinating many cellular pumps. Now, it's possible to obtain complex dynamics in simple systems, for example, like a logistic reproduction. However, plausibly, the only way in which the complex properties to follow can be obtained is through complex coordination of constraints of the kind neural, muscular, and skeletal coordinations exemplify. And one of the things that we talked about, basically this whole idea of new relation processes and the emergence of the nervous system is really one basic idea of how that this nervous system as a platform has this role of enablement for the organism is through this massive, basically, coordination of these small constraints. Now, these have their origin in the complex coordination of biochemical products and gradients that allow intercellular chemistry to support cellular maintenance. We are here, far from holonomic constraints, and as cellular regeneration shows, basically the no work and constraints conditions of the standard analytical mechanics and deep into the domain of multiple state-dependent interacting non-holonomic constraints, which as actually Jessica brought it up, this whole idea that the nervous system and a spatial locomotive dynamics that the brain allows for a complex organism to initiate is basically pushes the organism into the domain of non-holonomic constraints rather than purely parochial holonomic constraints of being basically constrained by rigid spatiotemporal positioning. Questions, discussions before we move forward?
I have a question about self-organization.
Sure.
And I'm a bit confused as to how we would then see something like selection pressure. I may be confused about the kind of sense in which self-organization is quote-unquote internally or externally driven.
Mm-hmm.
And so adaptation relative to a set of selection pressures from the environment, do those contribute to self-organization, or are they not?
It's a very interesting question. I think the selection. The thing is that, and I might be totally wrong, and I would appreciate if other people also share their ideas. But to me, the selection criteria isn't. I think it would be better for us to dissociate it from self-organization processes, because it is an external factor, an external constraint. Yes, there is an adaptation of self-organization, but self-organization, in a physical, precise sense, is usually that internal physical sense. When we talk about selective adaptation, selection pressure, we are talking about process of construction. Self-organization is different really from construction. It's basically the idea, as I said, is the autonomous internal, basically self-organizing dynamics, whereas construction, again, technically construed, is a different thing, precisely because it brings the role of this interaction. And this is one of the things that Darwin shows, that that basically, and also I think that argument can also be used against these kinds of wild speculative problems of self-organization dynamics in biology, that Darwin shows that basically this whole idea of interaction, which basically subscribe the organism to these adaptive pressures, selective pressures, can be in fact interpreted as in terms of basically computational constraints of the system to its environment, where the constraint, yes, play a constructive role in determining, in basically guiding the self-organizing dynamic of the system. But I think the subtleties of these notions require us to kind of dissociate basically this guiding construction via selective pressure and the computational interaction with the environment from that precise notion of internal self-organizing dynamism.
Cool. So yeah, there's a bracketing off of the environment in this. In
yes, yes, yeah. And actually, the thing is that there is this essay. I will try to find it. I have completely forgotten the title and also the name of the author. he comes up with this, really fantastic kind of philosophical commentary in terms of, basically understanding of the difference between construction, as I said, and self-organization. Self-organization, basically, in a precise sense, assumes no necessary, basically, reliance on this intervention of extrinsic factors. Now, with the thing with the idea of construction is that it can have both self-organization and also something that negates this self-organization, namely an extrinsic external factor. And he talks about this in terms of basically Kantorian understanding, the philosophical intuition behind Cantor's idea of self-diagonalization. The idea of, for construction, as different from this idea of self-organization in that sense, is the idea that basically you have the self-referential mechanisms within this self-organizing regime, plus a negative regime that should negate or simply randomize this self-referential dynamics in order to be able to reorient it. Thoughts, comments, discussions?
So on kinetics there? I mean, is it as an example?
Sorry?
So like an example of this kind of counter system of random selection would be then like mutation in genetics, right? Is that a good example? Or?
Yes, we talk about mutation, yes, but also mutation can also be seen in terms of, yes, I think yes, it can. Actually, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, yes. But I think we can, for people who are interested in philosophy, like, think of Hegel's Geist. Hegel's Geist is not just a self-organizing system. People always, when they talk about, especially in the continental philosophy, take Zizek's Less Than Nothing. It refers to Hegel's Geist as a self-organizing complex system. Now the thing is that once you look at it, it's not really a self-organizing system in that precise technical sense, precisely because Geist develops by negating itself, basically always drawing on the intelligibility of the objective world, using it as the power of negation to basically to what as I said, disorganize the self-organizational tendencies of the Geist. Because this whole idea of there is this idea that the thing is that if Geist is completely self-organizational for Hegel, then it's actually it can never gain traction on the absolute. It simply expand the order of itself, which is the order of appearances, the parochial idea of the Geist. But the whole idea of the Geist is that each epoch of the Geist, or each a stage of the progress in the odyssey of the spirit, is that it's this concurrent move between how it organizes itself from what it takes itself to be, namely the order of its appearances, but also at the same time by negating it by the power of reason and using the objective intelligibility of the world. And that's basically the movement of sciences. Sciences create catastrophes basically for the self-organizational tendency of the spirit within the order of appearances.
Is that a kind of heuristics?
It's not really heuristics because it's really the power of judgment. Judgment is very different from heuristics in a Kantian Hegelian understanding. Judgment is the power of the concept, is the power of the rule that has objective traction basically on the domain of intelligibilities.
My question to build off that is like this category of self-organization or calling something a self-organized, is that the kind of heuristic? I guess.
The majority, actually, one of the things is that it's quite strange that so many of these properties of complex systems that we talked about, I mentioned that there are no canonical definitions for them. And a lot of them have heuristic basis of basically detecting them or talking about them. Yes.
Yeah, so I was going to save this for later, but it is sort of building off of our discussion from sort of Hegel, the basic definition of complexity as the amount of history embedded in a system, or sort of like historical data. And I was sort of trying to backtrack from that to sort of the Kantian definition of history and the Kantian idea of technique of nature specifically, as sort of like in order to make sort of something that seems random intelligible, imposing these kind of constraints of purposiveness on it, where you're kind of bracketing sort of the outside and looking at a system in terms of what it sees its goal as or what constraints it puts on itself. And sort of human beings doing this in sort of history with reason, but in order to make nature intelligible, sort of the technique of nature is to treat natural phenomena as if they're goal-directed when you know they're not.
Yes, well, this is one of the things that is really, I think, I kind of mentioned about this very briefly in the last session, the idea that, the whole idea, the majority of the stuff that we talk about complexity sciences, in terms of functions and stuff, are analogically posited on our linguistic reasoning, theoretical and practical functions. Especially this, you need to be very careful with this idea of functions in nature, because all of the talks about functions in nature are analogically posited with regard to our models of practical reasoning. Just as, for example, the ideas of representation, and for example, when we talk about, organism representation, computational representation, all of this stuff, 3 dots, instead of fly, 3 dots in this space. All of these talks about representation at any kind of empirical based vocabulary, using any kind of empirical based vocabulary. They're also analogically posited on our theories of truth, theoretical reasoning. Basically, they are linguistically posited. They're analogical. You need to be very careful. That's why we need to be very careful with this stuff, because if we do not apply these analogical posits carefully, we fall into all sorts of bad metaphysical assumptions about the nature of functions, nature of representation, so on and so forth.
And this is where I guess sort of emphasizing primacy of the practical, or what you were talking about before with looking at sort of like basic assumptions about physics in like prepositions and like metaphor, like in concepts embedded in metaphorical language.
Yes, but also
analysis.
Sure, but I mean, you can think about this. I mean, you can see this in fact among all these scientists, or even computer scientists, biologists, neuroscientists, who usually talk about intentionality. Or for example, kind of the functional architecture of cognition. You see that there is a tendency to conflate massive amounts of basically different levels of analogy into just one basically analogical scheme. Representation, basically intentionality is, and that's basically what allows them to make that kind of massive reductionist or inflationary leaps from kind of modular representation at the level of modular processes to representation of the conceptual representation that we talk about, namely semantic representation, or reducing, for example, the semantic complexity of linguistic representation, which is or intentionality in our things, to that kind of extremely parochial sense of representation that, for example, you see it in any kind of semi-complex, basically computational system. It's capable of simply. You can see it in basically any kind of neuroscience, philosophy of neuroscience. In fact, Mettinger is also, I think, at fault in these things. When he talks about consciousness, he basically drops. He assumes an analogical point of view, but he attributes this analogical point of view as some sort of kind of metaphysical certainty. To the point that basically he conflates ultimately representation and intentionality at the level of discursive apperceptive self-consciousness, which is a completely linguistic phenomenon thought as a picture of language as such, with basically phenomenal consciousness, which is an empirical consciousness. And then he basically comes up with these philosophical understandings of philosophical commentaries on basically that our self-consciousness, conceptual self-consciousness, is basically simply an extension of empirical consciousness. Or then he also again does the same kind of move in reverse, inflating the kind of claims that he has derived from his investigation of phenomenal empirical consciousness, again to conceptual self-consciousness and intentionality at the level of conceptual self-consciousness. That creates a kind of really this almost Gnostic, dark Gnostic, basically worldview, which is you can see this massively if you look at the kind of the horror side of blogging, speculative realism. You can see it in the work of Scott Baker. There's basically a massive amount of conflation between the stuff that's going on, at different levels. You need to be very careful with this analogical position. Nothing wrong with analogical position, but we need to know that first of all, our theories of representation and functions are analogically posited. Analogically posited with regard to what? Our theories of truth, namely coherentist accounts of theoretical reasoning and practical reasonings, accounts of function according to basically how we see things functions linguistically. And then we'll talk about this in terms of when we talk about this in terms of this whole idea of different levels of vocabulary that people usually deploy to describe different phenomena at different level. For example, the moral vocabularies, normative vocabularies, logical vocabularies, and some people always try to reduce all of these vocabularies to an empirical base set of vocabularies, namely, and those empirical vocabularies are the vocabularies of special sciences. But the whole point is that empirical vocabularies cannot be posited unless there are different normative modal vocabularies. And we will talk about this at length in the third module, about so many of these kinds of conflations going around in these kinds of looking at complex systems, looking at cognition as a complex systems, and then trying to reduce it, or inflating the claims that you have derived from some empirical observation to basically conceptual self-consciousness, semantic consciousness.
Yeah, that's great. I'll definitely want to return to those examples at some point. That's all really helpful. And yeah, just, I don't know, I'm still trying to think about this from sort of a Kantian perspective of sort of respecting the sort of separation between the empirical and the transcendental.
Yes. No, I think, in fact, I wanted to ask you guys, but I mean, we can talk about these. I think we need to have some sort of extra sessions somewhere so we can talk about some of this like stuff more casual way. It would be great. I mean, I'm not sure how many of you have read, Kant's, Critique of Pure Reason. I think it's one of the most astonishing works ever produced, and it would be actually a superb, kind of introduction for, third module when we talk about AGI and construction of artificial intelligence and human level AI. I think these are absolutely, I think, really, because these kinds of stuff that as you address, is not only methodologically important in terms of not making these kinds of conflations, but actually gives a roadmap of how you can analogically posit in a controlled manner a base level, basically AI, and then analogically bootstrap it to where the AI is no longer analogically posited, precisely because it is, at that point, is a conceptual intelligence. It has a semantic complexity of cognition. So the representation is no longer analogically posited precisely because it is now embedded in language, because it has autonomous conceptual capacities.
Does that bring us back to self-organization, or is this a bad conflation?
No. It's not really part of self-organization. We will talk about it. It's simply it's a construction. It's a construction.
Okay. And yeah, do you know of anything that, just to sort of close that uses this framework from the third critique of sort of technique of nature in talking about sort of complex systems, or trying to sort of draw pattern or structure out of chaos? Because they seem sort of very...
Not really, no.
Yeah, I guess just by way of the way we talked about history, or like as in a Hegelian or Kantian framework, what someone who's talking about complexity means by history, they would refer to as nature.
Yes. Yeah.
And that history, you can only talk about history in that sense as an analogy to a sort of human, practical sense of history.
Yes, but also
as a way of understanding it.
Sure, but also, I mean, in fact, one of the most troubling things behind this is that, as I said in the previous session, there is a time bias inside this. It's the whole idea, that consciousness has a inbuilt perspectival temporal awareness, a temporal bias simply. It basically sees basically time in terms of temporal instantiation, temporal asymmetry, past, present, future, with past being always, overprivileged, present being, basically being kind of the dominant framework, and then the future is like this kind of nebulous framework that basically is all determined by basically the histories of the system. And the thing is that this absolutely, this kind of temporal perspective that we use, I don't think that we should inflate it into some sort of objective conception of time. Mm-hmm. In fact, this is basically the whole idea of McTaggart as a neo-Hegelian, to show that we absolutely have no capacity, we cannot draw an inference about the objectivity or the nature of time from our temporal perspective or awareness. And in fact, if we do that, in fact, we end up having the unreality of time. That time, the conception of time as being instantiated in basically within a temporal series, past, present, future, is essentially a vicious circle. It's a regress argument. Basically, all of your past, present instantiation, in order for them to be able to coherently define them, you need to again have all of the past, present instantiation, namely the entire temporal concept of time. I want to suggest that really I think it would be great if you can look at McTaggart's essay on reality of time is absolutely one of the most phenomenal articles written on time. And so many people usually dismiss this as, oh, well, it argues about unreality of time. No, what McTaggart discusses really is not really unreality of time or showing that there is no such a thing as an objective concept of time. What he tries to show that if you try to draw inference from your temporal perspective or awareness, namely a temporal series, and talk about time in that sense, you will end up, your argument basically amounts to nothing but unreality of time. That time becomes simply an ideality, basically, that is exclusive to conceptual consciousness. And this is something that I will, as I said, I will talk about this in terms of Boltzmann and how he basically reinterprets this, this idea that, the difference between the block view of time and the temporal or the asymmetric view of time. And basically one of the tasks I think would be to show that there is no incommensurability between our pragmatic view of time, namely temporalities, past, present, future, and the block view of time. A view of time in which basically there is no privileging of any asymmetrical point within a block of time. You don't call them anymore past, present, future in order to be able to, talk about the history of the system. And then you see that once you can't really talk about the system anymore, then you have to develop a new, basically, conceptual tools in order to explain, basically causation. You need to be able to develop new tools to talk about system history, in fact. In fact, I would say that system history needs to go away if an objective view of time shows that we cannot impose our temporal, basically, conception of time on physical systems. In any case, I will talk about this much more. Yes.
Can you please
Yes.
go back a bit to talk about Geist and why it's not a self-organization system, whatever?
Yes.
Like what you started talking about.
Sure. You see, the thing is that in phenomenology of the spirit, Hegel's makes different descriptions about Geist, and some of them are actually quite self-organizing. They give you the sense that Geist is a self-organizing entity. But toward the end, he talks about this in terms of this self-disintegration, that Geist, if it does not have a self-disorganizing, a self-disintegrating mechanism, basically it cannot initiate new epochs. Hence, it ceases to be a Geist. It loses its intelligibility of being a spirit as such. Now, the thing is that what is exactly this mechanism of disintegration is the power of negation, implicit within the power of judgment. Determinate negation, not abstract negation, determinate negation, namely resolving the incompatibilities in material inference. And this power of determinate negation, for Hegel, is sharpened by basically sciences as different, but also in connection from manifest rationality. Okay.
I have a really quick question on.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Would I be right in thinking that this distinction between disabling and enabling constraints, that's well embodied in the notion of generative entrenchment?
Yes. Yes. The whole, basically, the enabling, the whole idea of, the enabling constraint is really, which also, they play also a disabling role, but once coordinated, they become enablement. Yes, that's precisely the idea of the platform of generative entrenchment. Yes.
Cool.
I mean, I kind of like made a very brief reference to that with regard to our nervous system example in terms of coordination of constraints. And we talked about the nervous system as a platform, and you see that basically once constraints are coordinated, a canalization process occurs. And once this canalization occurs, you have a specialization of functions. Basically enables, this canalization is that enabling process.
So if there's a decrease of degrees of freedom on one level and then an increase on another?
Yes, yes. Increase basically, I think one of the things is that when we are talking about enabling the role of constraint, we need to understand this enabling role in terms of functional organization. Basically, they play enablement for functional organization. At the level of a structure, there is that kind of a disabling, import. Whereas at the level of the functional organization and the functional architecture of the system, there is an enablement, a global enablement.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, so let's go. Oh my goodness, we're kind of behind. It's okay. We had nice talk. We can always make a makeup session. Okay, where was I? Okay, let me just share the screen. Okay. So we said that coordinated constraints can work their way around physical laws. For instance, with no single pump. Actually, I talked about this. Yes. So sorry, I completely confused. I think we are actually on the next item, which is intrinsically global coherence. So in analytic, Lagrangian dynamics, the globalness or otherwise of constraints is not directly considered. A holonomic constraint provides an inherently global geometrical constraint on motion in the sense of being specified everywhere, but not in the sense of demanding internal global coordination of variables. Some holonomic constraint may force component motions to be globally correlated, others will not. The same applies to non-holonomic constraints. Moreover, these can be partial rather than global, with a dynamic network of constraints structuring system dynamics, as in the cell. But if a system is to perform a global function, for example, metabolic regeneration, then this will force a global organization of its components to achieve it. Therefore, underlying a global functionality must be a global constraint on dynamics that ensures realization of the function. And that was just the point that I made. This must be so even when this constraint is realized through a network of state-dependent interacting non-holonomic constraints. For example, a network of work constraint cycles in the cell. Multiple global functionalities, characteristics of living systems, require multiple underlying global constraints. And these will normally be significantly but subtly interrelated in order to allow multiplexing, namely many component rules combining to realize a single function, and multitasking, namely the one component playing roles in realizing many functions. Now, multiplexing and multitasking are attractive because they reduce the number of required components while increasing system functionality and adaptability, and possibly even evolvability, albeit at the expense of increasing system complexity and possibly also increasing system instability and or rigidity. Another main feature which is important is this order and organization. The reason it's important is because of this, it's exactly like the concept of constraints, because they have an intuitive appeal. When we are talking about constraints, people usually think about limitation. There's so much confusion going around these kinds of concepts in complexity sciences. And the same thing about order and organization. Precisely because of that, their intuitive usage, people usually conflate different conceptions of order and organization. The constraints underlying global functionality require global organization as distinct from global order. A high degree of orderliness means internal uniformity, a crystal, while functional organization requires interarticulation of distinct components, for example, in a motor vehicle engine. Now, the root notion of order is that derived from algorithmic complexity theory. The orderedness of a pattern is the inverse of the length of its shortest, most compressed, complete description. Hence, gases being internally random are disordered, and regular crystals being internally uniform are highly ordered. But neither displays any functional organization. I will talk about this algorithmic complexity theory in the second module, and theory of Solomonov around this concept. Sometimes complexity is taken to be measured by the inverse of algorithmic orderedness, but this leaves gases the most complex systems. In short, it ignores organization. The key to living, basically, complexity. Machines and living things are organized because their parts are relatively unique, and each part plays distinct and essential roles in the whole. Now, the colloquial use of organization is broad and vague, though its core examples are functionally organized. Engines, firms, rescue teams, so on and so forth. So the use of organization that we are basically address here is basically functional organization. And whenever I talk about organization, unless otherwise it's stated as a structural organization, I mean it as a functional organization functionally interpreted. Now, another use of order we can talk of high order features, refer to features characterized by high order relations. That is to say, relations among relations among relations among relations. Then organization is a particular kind of ordering in this sense, involving relatively high order relations that characterize many nestings of correlations within correlations. Think of correlations within and between the motor, electrical management, and drive chain modules of a car, for example. That is, an organized system displays a non-redundant global ordering relation of relatively high order, including global subrelations, characterizing global functions. For this reason, organized systems must be less highly ordered than are crystals, but are obviously more highly ordered than a gas. A system's organizational depth is measured by degree of nesting of subordering relation within its global ordering relation. For example, cells within organs, within bodies, within communities. Living systems are deeply organized. However, organizational depth also does not fully capture complexity, basically in nonlinear dynamic systems. Now, the thing is that as we will talk about this idea of deep objects, as I said, this idea of computational depth or logical depth basically is a very useful way of measuring these various notions of depth. Nestings, nestings in hierarchies, time scale, deep, basically depth of a hierarchy, causal history, so on and so forth. So the key important thing with this basically idea of order in terms of interrelations and organizational depth is and also when we are talking about functional organization and organization complex system, is the concept of nesting, nested organization, nested hierarchy. And this is, I think, you need to, have it in order to be able to coherently differentiate it, this concept of organization and hierarchy, from kind of like the more intuitive idea of vertical hierarchies and kind of basically basic forms of organization. I mean, and the great thing about the ideas of measures of computational complexities is that computation, as we will talk about in the second modules, and the way that computational complexity is defined, allows us to basically develop different methods and come up using different computational toolboxes to basically identify and distinguish nestings, basically, even construct nesting, models nestings. Using iterations, recursion, long distance rules, short distance rules, so on and so forth. And so this is something that we will get back extensively in the second module. Now, the next one, which I said was modularity. A system contains a module if and only if, to a sufficiently good approximation to capture essential systems functionality, its dynamics can be expressed as an interactive product, the dynamical product of its intramodular dynamics and its intermodular dynamics, intra and intermodular dynamics. Three kinds of modularity can be distinguished: a spatial or horizontal, level or vertical, and process modularity, labeled respectively S, L, and P modularity. Now, S modularity obtains when there is a principal division of a system into contemporaneous spatial modules, such that the system dynamics is expressible as a product of the individual module dynamics and their interactions. This is how we currently design and model buildings and machines of all kinds, from homes to hotels, typewriters, television sets, so on and so forth, and how we usually attempt to model both biological populations, modules being the phenotypes, and often their individual members, where the module is being basically the internal organs or cells. Now, L modularity, in contradistinction, obtains when a system's dynamics may be decomposed into the interactive products of its dynamics at different system constraint levels. This is often how, for example, business management functionally analyzes a firm. Often that organization will express a management hierarchy and be graphically represented vertically, often realizing the functional roles vertically in a building, hence the alternative vertical label. It is also, often an important part of a machine design. For example, motor vehicle electrical regulation and drive chain modules, and of the scale analysis of organisms, cells, organs, organisms, etc. Now, P modularity, process modularity, obtains when a system's dynamics may be decomposed into the interactive product of its process dynamics, and is characterized of the analysis of organisms and complex machines into mechanisms such as cellular respiration, pulp mill regulation. As motor vehicle design illustrates, all three modularities may be combined at least to significant extent in current simple engineering design. Now, S and L modularity will create the constraints to enable corresponding functions in simple, reliable ways through the process, disabling many other, basically, processes. The earlier viable system movement that sprang from cybernetics and general system theory, relied on basically such designs. But modular processes may also cut across levels and spread throughout the system, and basically to that extent exclude S and L modularity. And so we can only have, that basically as a dominant framework, a P modularity, process modularity. Now, modularity of any kind reduces system complexity by decreasing dynamical degrees of freedom, while increasing functional and possibly developmental reliability and ease of repair. So we need to understand that, basically the modularity is one of those topics where the concept of complexity starts to kind of diverge, bifurcates. On one side, a structural complexity, and the other side, functional complexity. And modularity usually leads to functional complexity rather than structural complexity. So now, and obviously, when we have the modularity and the organization and order that we talked about, we need to also take into account basically the property of the hierarchy. Hierarchy proper is asymmetry of level, basically vertical control in a sufficiently L-modular system. While common in machine design and as underlying principle in organism and in situational design, pure hierarchy is in fact the exception and is rarely more than partial in living systems. A higher level constraints lower level dynamics, as in crystal lattice constraints the behavior of its atomic constituents, will often regulate it through feedback. for example, coherence of crystal vibrations. And sometimes it will also control the lower levels in important respects. Think of top-down control, brain control of basically muscular thresholds. But it will also typically be true that lower level dynamics will constrain higher levels. For example, electron orbital dynamics constrains crystal angles, may regulate them through feedback. In example in catalysis of chemical reactions, and might control certain aspects of the higher level, bottom-up control, indirect control of volume. Basically in Hebbian learning. And very briefly, Hebbian learning is just this idea of basic model of synaptic plasticity. The basic formula can be rudimentary put as fire together, wire together. This idea that basically the adjacency, the neighborhood of two, for example, an axon and basically another neuron, once one is repeatedly basically stimulated by the other, then the plasticity of basically these neurons starts to structurally shift. They basically they structurally change, and basically this is one of the things that basically the idea of the Hebbian learning or Hebbian rule also can be understood as this kind of these variations, these effects of basically shift in a structure between these different levels of hierarchies, and how they basically they impose a structural change on one another. So now, path dependence. I remember that we talked about. I think in the previous session, very briefly, path dependence. Occurs whenever there is a positive amplification. For then initially nearby dynamic trajectories subsequently diverge as a function of the small differences in their initial conditions. So the path taken depends on precisely where the first step began. A notable subclass of path dependencies are those where once begun, development along a certain path itself become increasingly entrenched. This applies where an initial fluctuation is amplified and entrenched, especially where that entrenchment involves a bifurcation that reinforces the irreversibility of the development. Now, examples of this include a particular impurity site of first freezing, or of rolling boiling phenomena that I talked about. In reversibility, irreversible processes. You can think about this as a first oil discovery. Basically the opening of a shop in a new suburb that transforms a local economy. Now, the thing is that these cases exhibit a clear sense of historical possibilities exploited and correlatively of others foregone, and the resulting paths are often said to fix their initial historical conditions. By contrast, for stable systems in an attractor basin, there is no overall path dependence, since the same outcome occurs for all beginning points. Basically, for beginning points, by beginning points I mean initial conditions. The third and the final, type of constraints are constraint duality and the relation to supersystem formation. Now, coordinated constraints that enable while disabling Um, the disabling movement constraints imposed by a skeleton and its enabling of locomotion and leverage exhibit general constraint duality. So this idea of disabling, enabling while also disabling. So this is basically the idea of general constraint duality. The notion has a specific application to forming system into supersystems through mutual interaction. System constraints may contribute to enabling supersystem capacities. For example, you can think of this, the role of mitochondria in eukaryote energy production. Conversely, supersystem constraints may free up system constraints. For example, whenever multicellular capacities permit member cells to specialize. But it has a wider application in considering, for example, social community formation. We can gain a crude measure of the importance of socialization to a species by considering the ratio of usable individual parametric plasticity, i.e. adaptiveness, between isolate and communal states. For simpler creatures of lesser neural capacities and more rigid social organization, such as of insects, the relation is typically negative. Individual capacities are sacrificed to communal cohesion and function. Oppositely, for example, humans increase their coherently usable individual capacities enormously through collective, basically, culture, through this basically mobilizing the constraint duality in order to generate supersystem formation. And this happens even while contributing to communal capacities in terms of humans. Unless humans have a sophisticated, high-quality cultural environment in which to develop, there will be vast reaches of our somatic, especially neural organizational space that we cannot use because it is not accessible to us. Thus, for humans, there is a positive relationship between individual and communal capacities, and that can be expressed through this constraints duality and supersystem formation. Coupled constructively, each enables the other, and together they largely, but not wholly, dominate those coupled competitively. We can speculatively picture this effect increasing through the mammalian line as brain size, intense socialization, and intentional action increase together. This makes all the difference to the power of basically a supersystem formation like culture, to its significance in adaptive evolution, and to the intricacy and globalness of its organized dynamics. So, the last ones, the last features, and it seems that we are running low, but I will try to speed it up so we can get at least the idea of the Boltzmann informational content of the system. So the other, property of complex systems that needs to be taken into account is this coordinated spatial and temporal differentiation with functional organization. Multiplexed, multitask functions, and as I mentioned them, cannot all be realized simultaneously at every location. The resulting interference would render reliable performance impossible. It is necessary then to distribute the realizing dynamical activities spatially and temporally so that each local area over each process cycle is restricted to a coherent set of concurrent activities. Moreover, these distributions have to be subtly organized so that each function is realized at convenient locations and times for receiving its inputs, and also useful locations and times to contribute its output. Similarly, for example, similar metabolism requires a group of closed self-reproducing processes to recreate the constraints for each process from the products of other processes. And this too requires subtle spatial and temporal differentiation to achieve reliability and effectiveness. So it is kind of this particular feature is very tied to the notion and the concept of scheduling. And we will get to this not particularly under this heading, but we'll talk about this idea of scheduling and its computational importance when we talk about concurrent systems and the concept of scheduling in basically computer science, in terms of this kind of a resource-sensitive distribution of processes. Questions, stuff, thoughts, commentaries? Any comments by Adam on resource sensitivity? Okay, sorry, go on.
I was just going to ask again about this distinction within hierarchy, and was it between a structural and functional hierarchy?
You want to know what is exactly the distinction between functional hierarchy and a structural hierarchy?
I just wanted to clarify that that was the distinction.
Oh, sorry, I totally blanked out. Okay, you need to repeat this.
I just wanted to make sure that I have this distinction right in my mind within the notion of hierarchy, that one sense of it is the structural hierarchy and the other one is the functional hierarchy. Just because this is something seems to be implicated also in the modularity bit as well as...
Absolutely. Yes, yes, absolutely.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
And then as we basically, this is the whole, the course as it evolves, it's just what we are doing is just simply introducing this underlying massive different things that makes a complex system a complex thing. And then as we are moving through the computational module, we are trying to basically start to bifurcate, distinguish this structural complexity from functional complexity. And then in the third module, we are trying to integrate them. But the whole idea is that if we are not able to differentiate them properly, we get massive amounts of conflation, eliding different distinctions at different levels, basically. And this is really, really, I think, important topic when people talk about in cognitive science, really, in picture of the mind, and also respectively construction of AI, of human-level AI. This conflation between function and structure is important, and also respectively complexity at the level of functional hierarchy and complexity at the level of structural hierarchy.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense to me. And another kind of terminology question was one of the senses of order I had conflated with level, but I think in your slides you actually at one point you say multi-level and multi-order, and I'm a bit confused between the distinction between level and order in that context.
Well, it was about the interrelation of components.
Yes.
It's about interrelations. Yes, you have order. You can think it intuitively in terms of the hierarchical ordering, deep ordering, basically, but also order at the level of intra-level, interrelations among stuff, basically, among components, among generative mechanisms at that level. So its interlevel order can be thought interlevel and intralevel. And you need especially epistemic mapping when we are trying to talk about this order. When actually we look at complex phenomena, we need to come up with models, and that was the plurality model argument that we had last session. In order to be able to map and recognize both interlevel depth, order in that sense, and intralevel order. And this is, basically a good book really into this different, why is it really important epistemically to differentiate them and develop different models, basically different epistemic maps in order to be able to map these different variations of orders in physical complex phenomena. A good book on this topic is Mark Wilson, Essay on Conceptual Behaviors. It's a really meandering book, but nevertheless it's a really classic, superb book on development of mappings, modeling at these different levels in order for you to be able to picture intra-level behaviors, order at the level of intra-level behaviors, and order at the level of inter-level behaviors. Usually, when typical classical models are basically just try to align the distinction between them, so all you get is either a very, a classical one-to-one relationship between the level order at the, at the basically in terms of intra-level and your model, or model that simply gives a complete, basically, intra-level without differentiating these intra-level, interrelations, namely order at the level of intra-level behaviors.
Right, because these distinctions shape into different kinds of reduction.
Yes, and once you have this kind of elision of different, different concepts and sense of order and behaviors, was not only you get greedy reductionism, but also you get greedy inflationarism. Whenever there is a greedy reduction, you need to expect greedy inflation as well. In fact, the majority of people who are that kind of reductionist always comes with inflationary accounts of, for example, as I talked about in terms of empirical consciousness, once you try to basically align this distinction between different levels of consciousness and really reduce it to that base empirical consciousness, then you are also tempted to inflate conclusions driven from empirical consciousness to level of basically conceptual consciousness, to different levels, other grades of consciousness. Any more comments, thoughts, stuff?
Reza, I have a question.
Sure.
You've I think gestured to some of this already, but as you earlier on, you distinguished some of these characteristics we've been going through as being associated primarily with living phenomena. Which ones would you say are most, or might be most directly applicable to understanding social systems, and which ones should be we be especially skeptical about being applied in those contexts? Here I'm thinking about something like war, where the notion of sensitivity to initial conditions would be compared to like Clausewitz's notion of friction in order to describe how small causes are amplified to produce like macro effects, which can't be predicted because of problems from distortion or information overload.
Well, I think sensitivity to initial condition is really one of those base features of all complex systems, and in fact it spans across social phenomena, life phenomena, so on and so forth. But for example, when we're talking about self-organization, irreversibility, these kinds of stuff, that becomes very context sensitive, and that's where you need to be careful not to not to apply it, but be careful in applying these concepts like irreversibility, especially like self-organizing in from life phenomena to social phenomena to cultural phenomena. But sensitivity to initial condition, I think, is probably the most fundamental. It's basically, as we talked about, it's basically the consequence of the loss of linear superposition principle, which is, you know, the main basic feature of any kind of nonlinear complex dynamic system.
So you'd say that functions as a kind of that minimal definition.
Yes, yes, that's it. But as I was trying to argue, it's so minimal that becomes so prevalent that it almost becomes trivial.
Yes, yes.
So you need to top it with other features, but those features need to be context sensitive in order for you to be able to effectively talk about this this sensitivity to initial conditions within the framework that you are talking about.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. Thank you.
Welcome. Okay, can we go for 20 more minutes, or you guys are tired?
No, keep going.
Yeah, sounds good. Keep going.
Okay.
Fine with me.
Sorry, I lost my slides here. Okay, my God, this is okay. I'm going to skip over the autonomy thing because the autonomy, I mean, I will talk about it later on. It's the last in our basically and basically characteristics of complex systems. So in order for me to be able to talk about the Boltzmann stuff. But before that, moving to Boltzmann informational content of a system, I want to talk a little bit about condition-dependent laws. And I briefly talked about, you know, laws, determinism, and causality in complex systems in the last session. Now, condition-dependent laws, you know, compared to the universal invariant laws of physics, the local idiosyncratic behavioral patterns exhibited by many complex systems don't seem to qualify as laws. You know, of course, biology and cognitive sciences dealing with complex systems do use universal laws in constructing their models. For example, if their elemental laws of chemistry did not operate the same everywhere, biochemistry and hence biology would be much harder than it already is. Now, even so, the complication arises from the fact that the nomic invariance largely occurs at the, you know, for example, union interaction level, but how n-body, k-component, ion systems operate is often a sensitive function of the initial and constraints condition, especially organizational conditions. The biochemistry, for example, of carbon-hydrogen chains provides, you know, eloquent illustration, for instance, where folding history can alter subsequent interaction dynamics. That's why no simple set of laws can be deduced in advance in, you know, defining complex systems. However, the phenomenon is universal within science. It's not just restricted to complex sciences. For example, consider that electric circuit dynamics is the outcome of many universally lawful component interaction, but it is the material circuit conditions that determine the outcome circuit law, whether it is oscillation, exponential decay, or other. Now, these circuit design dependent dynamics are properly considered law-like despite arising from a specific material conditions. Now, moreover, the point extends to law conditioned on self-organization, a distinctively complex system circumstance. Pertinently, self-organization precisely occurs because of the sensitivity of dynamical form to dynamical initial and constraints conditions. But since self-organization involves a new dynamical form, it is reasonable to say that it obeys new dynamical laws characteristic of that form. For instance, consider this condition: a cooling mold of liquid iron in contact with a heat reservoir of lower temperature. It leads to a new emergent laws: rigid body, not fluid dynamics; crystalline, not fluid conduction of electricity, heat, and sound. The universality requirement drops out, basically, in this schema. Then we are free to see biology and cognitive domains as replete with real laws, just as is physics. It is at most that they will be condition dependent on highly intricate, perhaps idiosyncratic, and typically organizational conditions. They will be special, as some philosophers say, laws basically in dealing with complex systems. Also, within this framework, their form will be hard to predict, but so far at least this distinguishes them from the situation in physics by at most a matter of degree, not kind. So it's when we are talking about condition dependency of law in complex systems, there is this condition dependency, a specialized form of laws, and this specialized laws of complex dynamics in complex systems need to be understood in terms of variation in degrees, not kind, with regard to fundamental laws of physics. So, starting, with one of the main figures of complexity sciences, and I absolutely recommend you guys looking deep into his work, is Ludwig Boltzmann, revolutionary, absolutely, excellent, kind of insights into systems, into how systems work. Basically, how things in the broadest possible sense hang together in the most broadest possible sense. That was basically, Boltzmann idea of how to see the world, in light of this formula, how things hang together. And we have, as we talked about in first session and the second session, this idea of how things hang together, this idea of interaction, is coupled with the idea of behavior of the system, and interaction and behavior in terms of how things hang together in the broadest possible sense, is basically the most fundamental idea in complexity sciences, which basically the whole is not, of course, it's not exclusive to complex sciences, but we saw that basically this idea of how things hang together non-linearly can lead to massive, basically, new ramifications in how we should approach a system. Now, of course, beside this idea of how things hang together as basic definition behind this whole idea of complexity sciences, Boltzmann also came up with so many other revolutionary ideas. So many of them have only been, revisited in the last couple of decades. And one of them was the idea of time that I definitely plan to talk about, if not this session, at some point. Now, this idea that how things hang together is a key to understand complex systems, brings us to the idea of the information content of a system. Basically, the information content of the system is really of answering that how the information content of a system can be described is to answer how can we model and describe how things hang together in a system. The information content of a system, gives us a measure of the ordering present in a system, as well as the amount of usable energy contained within the system. In its origin, this parameter, can be traced back to, as I said, the revolutionary work of Boltzmann on a statistical thermodynamics dating from 1866. His basic idea was that any macroscopic system could be envisioned as consisting of a large number of particles, typically on the order of 10 power 23 particles. The macroscopic properties of the system would result from a statistical averaging of the mechanical motions of the system constituent particles. It was also assumed that any ensemble of the microstate of a system that yielded a given value of a macroscopic property would be equally likely to occur. On this basis, the probability of finding the system with its known macroscopic properties is proportional to the number of microscopic states available to it. And this number is denoted by the symbol W. Boltzmann defined the macroscopic entropy S of a system by this formula. S equals K natural logarithm W. This is the logarithmic connection between entropy and probability. In this formula, K, is the Boltzmann constant. If each of, in this formula, we can say that if each of the I microscopic configuration has a different probability Pi of occurring, the equation then becomes this. Summation by the I, Pi natural logarithm Pi. And the K being the Boltzmann constant. Now, in the 20th century, there developed a growing consensus regarding the existence of an intimate relationship between the concept of entropy and information. And this entropy, as I talked, is basically this idea of how things hang together. And I will talk about this later on again when I'm going to talk about logical depth. So, basically, the consensus, the emerging consensus in the 20th century was this intimate relationship between the concept of entropy and information. The entropic content of a system and the informational content of the system. Of the key importance in this regard was the work of Shannon, who conjectured that the information contained within a message must be related to its internal organization. The measure of missing information or uncertainty in messages that he proposed took the same form as the entropy defined in statistical thermodynamics. He argued that for a system that could exist in n possible states, I1 to n, each of which had an associated probability of pi. The uncertainty in the system u would be given then as this formula, which is basically the redefinition of the Boltzmannian entropic states. The negative value of the parameter u is described as the information content or negentropy of the system and is usually given the symbol u. Now, negentropy is reverse entropy, or basically the entropy deficit of a dynamically ordered subsystem relative to its surrounding chaos. So, negative value of the parameter u as described as the information content or negentropy is basically is really our index of how things hang together in the broadest possible sense in a system. Now, in the wake of 20th century system and information theories, it has been widely recognized that systems operate by virtue of the fact that they contain information, or in other words, are ordered in particular ways. And this information content, in the sense of how things hang together, is precisely what is exploited to characterize and measure complexity of systems. So ultimately, as we are going to talk about, the measures of complexity are different specifications of how things hang together in the system. In contrast to randomness, which can be measured by the entropy in a system, complexity cannot be determined by one single measure that is applicable in all situations. Different measures are needed to describe such features as the extent to which the parts of a complex system interact and the manner in which the action of the parts are coordinated. It is in this sense that we can see and talk about the measures of complexity in terms of the hermeneutics of complex systems or deep objects. Basically, why I'm using hermeneutics, because hermeneutics traditionally in philosophy is a part of a relationship, really. How parts hang together in the broadest possible sense gives us a hermeneutic interpretation of a deep object, a whole. And what we are going to, examine basically in the next session, and also in the beginning of the second module, is the computational hermeneutics of deep objects. You can think of life, intelligence, ultimately cognition and language. But before that, we need to introduce one key measure of complexity before moving forward to the other two measures of complexity that I mentioned. And so this measure, this key measure of complexity that basically allows us to talk about the computational hermeneutics of how things hang together as a measure of complexity is Charles Bennett's concept or complexity measure known as logical depth. Now, there have always been, in three major directions along which the frontiers of physics have advanced: toward the very large, toward the very small, and toward the complex. A central role in statistical mechanics, the field of physics dealing traditionally with complex systems, is played by entropy, as I talked. This role has many facets. First of all, entropy is a thermodynamic concept closely related to temperature and not needing any microscopic interpretation. Secondly, as shown by Boltzmann, it is a measure of disorder or randomness. Finally, according to Shannon, it measures an amount of information. What information this is depends on the circumstances. In dynamical system theory, it is this final aspect of entropy, third aspect of entropy, which is the most important one. For a chaotic system, the entropy is the most direct measure of non-determinacy, as it measures the amount of information which one needs in order to specify a long trajectory, independently of the particular coding used to describe the trajectory, provided only it is sufficiently fine. This information increases by ht, where t is time and h is called Kolmogorov-Sinai or metric entropy. It is due to this linear increase with time that chaotic systems are impossible to forecast on the long run. Even if we know the initial state extremely precisely, there will come a time when this information alone is no longer enough to allow any forecast. And that's basically this whole idea of logical depth basically comes into the picture. But this information aspect is also valid. Example, in equilibrium statistical mechanics. There, the entropy is the missing information needed to specify the microstate if the macrostate is given. While the entropy is still the central concept in chaotic system theory, it has been realized more and more during the last few decades that it does not tell the whole story. There is a widespread feeling that besides entropy or randomness, there exists something which we have so far examined under the rubric complexity. So it seems that we have to get a better understanding of what this is, what this idea of complexity is at the deepest level. Now, in mathematics and computer science, there exists a quite elaborated theory of this informational complexity, a la Boltzmann, Shannon, and Kolmogorov. And it might seem at first straightforward to apply the concept developed there to physics, but this is not quite true. Now, the most popular definition of complexity of a string of symbols, the algorithmic or Kolmogorov Chaitin complexity, leads in the cases we are interested in just back to entropy. The Kolmogorov complexity of a string S, let me bring this so we can the Kolmogorov complexity of a string S of n symbols with n finally tending to infinity is defined via the shortest string of bits which can produce S as an output on a general purpose computer. This definition was made for strings such as the bits in computer program computing some well-defined function, or as the digits, 3, 1, 4, ad infinitum of pi number. First of all, neither the bits of a well-written program nor the digits of a small n can be random, as they refer to something very specific. Moreover, although the digits of n look perfectly random to a statistician, the required computer programs are surprisingly short, of length proportional to logarithm capital N only. Therefore, randomness in a statistical sense and complexity via a program length are very different here. The reason for this difference is that it is much easier to write a program which gives the first n digits, capital N, of a small n than one which gives n consecutive digits starting at some random position. It is essentially the latter which is tested by statistical tests. This difference does not exist for symbol sequences obtained from dynamical systems, provided the systems was time invariant under translation, and the initial configuration was randomly chosen from a stationary distribution. There it is obvious that coding of a sequence can be made efficient only by using correlations which exist between the symbols, and hence both concepts are the same. This applies, by the way, also to 2- or 3-dimensional patterns generated by spontaneous pattern-forming processes. Also here, Kolmogorov complexity is identical to Shannon entropy, and its use is, though not wrong, misleading. More precisely, Shannon entropy is the average of the complexity, but in these cases, one is only interested in averages anyway. If we want, therefore, a complexity which is not equivalent to entropy in the cases we are interested in, and as it seems many take it intuitively granted that such a concept exists, we have to look for something else. The direction where to look is suggested by computer science. In an admittedly vague sense, we can define the complexity of an object. Now, this object can be a pattern, a string, machine algorithm, so on and so forth. Is the difficulty of the most important task associated with this object. For instance, the space complexity of an algorithm is the amount of storage on a general-purpose computer which it needs, i.e., the difficulty to implement it, while its time complexity is the time it requires to basically execute this task. The Kolmogorov complexity of a sequence is in particular the difficulty of uniquely specifying the entire sequence, and accordingly it seems at first sight to agree perfectly with this definition. But specifying a sequence or a pattern is not necessarily the most important task related to it. Much important might be to understand it, i.e. to describe its meaning, basically the content of the information, descriptive content of the information. Now the problem with making the latter into something which a physicist can work with is, of course, meaning and understanding are not well-defined concepts in physics. A measure of complexity in this spirit is Charles Bennett's logical depth. The logical depth of a string S is essentially the time needed for a general-purpose computer to actually run the shortest program which generates S. For a random string, the time needed to generate S consists essentially of the time needed to read in the specification and is accordingly proportional to its length. In contrast to this, a string with great logical depth might have a very short program coding for it, but decoding the program takes a very, very long, much longer than the length of S itself. The prime example of a pattern with great logical depth is presumably life, biologically defined. As far as we know, life emerged spontaneously, i.e. with a program which was assembled randomly and which therefore had to be very, very short. But it has taken some 10⁹ years to work with this program until life, biologically conceived, assumed its present form. It's basically its biological form. A more formal example with presumably large logical depth is the central vertical column in the following figure. Can you see the picture? Yep. Okay. Now, this example from Wolfram. This figure is obtained with one of Wolfram's elementary cellular automata, rule number 86. In this cellular automaton, one starts basically with an infinite horizontal row of 0 and 1, and iterates by adding in each time step another row under and 1, and iterates by adding in each time step another row under the previous one, according to a fixed local rule. Now, in rule number 86, one writes 1 under each of the triples 110, 100, 010, and 001, while one writes 0 under every other triple. This figure is obtained by starting with the row 00010000 and by drawing a blank square for each one. Since both the initial configuration and the rule are very easy to describe, the central column has 0 Kolmogorov complexity. From very long simulation, it seems, however, that it has maximal entropy, just as the digits of number pi. Moreover, it is believed that there exists no other way of getting this column than by direct simulation, since it takes approximately n power n squared operations to iterate n time steps. We find that the logical depth is large indeed. Now, a very brief thing is that Bennett himself defines logical depth as the running time to generate the object in question by a near incompressible program. He states that this is intended as a measure of the value of information within a system. He says, logically deep objects contain internal evidence of having been the result of a long computation or a slow to simulate dynamical process and could not plausibly have originated otherwise. End quote. Now, the plausibility of its origin of this concept of logical depth comes from the assumption that the most likely program to produce an output would be the shortest one. This idea comes from, and I will talk about extensively this in the second module, comes from Andrei Solomonov work basically on algorithmic complexity. He justified this as a physically plausible measure of complexity by its obedience to a slow growth law of complexity. A slow growth law of complexity can also be seen in terms of causal history of basically a system. This informational law states that complexity can only arise slowly through stochastic processes, as presumably has occurred in evolution in the guise of causal histories. Causal histories of life, causal histories of cognition, so on and so forth. By its construction, one cannot produce a deep object from a shallow one by a deterministic process, and only improbably by a stochastic one. Thus, random strings and very simple ones both have a low logical depth. A random string is incompressible, and hence the minimal program that produces it is a simple copying program, which is quick. A simple pattern can be produced by a simple program, and so will also be fairly quick. Now, one problem which the logical depth, shares with Kolmogorov measure of complexity is that both are not effectively computable. In neither case, one can ever be sure to have found the most efficient coding of what may look like a random pattern. For this reason, one can only get an upper estimate for the Kolmogorov complexity of some not yet understood pattern found in nature. For the logical depth, this problem is even worse. There one cannot even be sure whether one's estimate is an upper or lower bound, as one could find shorter programs which need either less or more time to execute. Now, it's clear that once the notion of the concept of logical depth as one of the basic and very prevalent measures of complexity is very tied to concept of hierarchies, concept of causal history, and basically interlevel correlations. But I think also we need to be very careful the way that Bennett talks about this, and I have seen it, so many people actually very non-discriminately apply logical depth to any kind of hierarchy. The way that Bennett defines this measure of complexity is essentially basically assumes a kind of basically a how to say it, a kind of global basically incomputability of the hierarchical picture. But when we are looking into basically the nature of hierarchies, what we are really interested in is really basically the computational cost of one hierarchy basically functioning on top of the other. So people usually, when they basically, for example, like I said, like Nick Szabo, he tries to interpret, for example, things like basically tradition as a logically deep object via Bennett's concept of logical depth, and also attributing the concept of computational cost in terms of how, for example, what it would be the cost of us changing this part of tradition with with something new. The whole thing is that this kind of interpretation is shady basically at the base, precisely because Bennett's idea of logical deep object is globally incomputable, whereas the computational cost interpretation essentially assumes a computability of basically the intra-level hierarchical ordering. I'm going to talk about this, in the second module, much more extensively in terms of this kinds of interpretations that what arises when we apply a measure of computational complexity that has incomputability assumptions to basically properties of complex systems or measures of complex systems that basically have are based on basically effective computability. Basically, all you can't even talk about like things like the computational costs and hierarchical systems in that kind of interlevel scenario without having a paradigm of computability, effective computability. Yes, you need to have a general basically computability assumption while having a special incomputability cases, but you cannot have a global incomputability, general incomputability assumption, like as implicit in logical depth measure of complexity. Another thing that before, just this was just a very, very basic introduction on this idea of logical depth and deep objects in terms of entropy, informational content, and computational complexity. It was a basic, just introduction for our next session, which I will talk about this much more in details in relation to the other two main measures of complexity. But one of the things before finishing the session would be just a kind of like as a kind of, in order for you to be able to think around problems and ideas implicit in this idea of logically deep objects, would be think of this question as an exercise that think of an axiomatic system, and this axiomatic system can be, for example, a geometry book, basically an axiomatic theory based on sets of certain axioms, for example, Euclid's axioms, or any kind of other axiomatic system that you can think of, arithmetic axioms, geometric axioms, philosophical axioms, so on and so forth. Then think about this, whether an axiomatic system can be thought as a logically deep object or not. And there is a reason that I'm asking this question as an exercise, and the reason will only be clear when we talk about this, kind of address this problem of axiomatization, in computer science, and the axiomatic concept of program in the second module. But nevertheless, as a kind of a philosophical, exercise, thinking exercise, it would be great if you can think about this throughout this week. Think whether an axiomatic system or an axiomatic theory can be considered a logically deep object. If yes, why yes? If no, why no? And also make clear what you mean by an axiomatic system, because there are different forms of axiom and axiomatic system. But nevertheless, I want to hear your answers to this question, because we deal with this problem quite significantly in the second module. So, any questions, answers before we conclude this session and move to the more serious stuff in our final session of complexity and in the computer module.
I was curious about the logically deep object being something that could it express a static form? Does it have to be a process, or could it be something?
Well, a static form is. These are, I think, idealizations. The idea of the static form. I mean, the idea is that basically the concept of the logically deep or logical depth is a processual, computational object. But so as everything else, basically everything can be understood processually. Well, you need to basically all you need, and that's the whole. I will talk about this in the second module. One of the main difficulties currently in computer science is that there is no canonical definition of processes. And when it comes to processes, there are 700 algebras of processes, but there is no canonical definition. Still, we do not know what exactly a process is. And as long as you cannot define process and make it context sensitive, then yes, there are basically the notion of processuality becomes almost trivial. But yes, everything can be said to be a processual, basically, and in that sense of logical depth. So the whole idea of the aesthetic versus process is more of an idealized distinction rather than something that has an objective reality to it, because everything is really processual.
That's I was trying to see it in terms of distinguishing the structure and the function being more connected to the process, and the structure being something that could express stasis. Is that helpful at all?
Not really. No, process is, in fact, more on the side of the structure. Interestingly, functions come. Again, this is something that I will talk about. Functions come in different varieties. There are some functions that have a strong coupling with a structure, basically are kind of like tethered to their structural substrate. But there are, which also means that the kind of processes drive those structures. But there are also functions that are capable of constituting their own processes, basically giving rise to new forms of structure. And basically, a lot of functions in complex systems are of those kinds, are the ones that are capable of weakening their basically relationship with their specific structural substrate.
That's the destabilization?
That's a weakening. That's not a destabilization. That's just basically an idea of basically what we talked about, in terms of scaffolding and canalization. That's one of the things that happens when functions becomes extremely complex, become extremely specialized. They weaken, basically, they give rise to new structures. They introduce constraints, enabling constraints in basically in the hierarchical depth, hierarchical structural depth, and then they create revision. Basically, they initiate structural revisions in the hierarchy. The thing is that stability is always needs to be in place. I mean, technically understood, the word stability within a structural hierarchy. Otherwise, you don't get anything like a hierarchy, because hierarchy is an index of stability, and that's what we are going to talk about in terms of a statistical stability, a statistical complexity, and a structural stability as one of most fundamental measures of complexity.
That's great.
How much are we going to talk about stuff like adaptation, the impact of cycles of contingency, that kind of thing?
I will talk about them in the second module, but more under the rubric of this computational picture of Darwinian dynamics. I think when we are talking about contingency, I hope you do not mean it in terms of absolute ontologized contingency, because that we won't talk about that. But we will talk about, yes, contingency proper in terms of, for example, Darwinian selection is a good example of contingency. Yes, we will talk about this in terms of the computational picture of this kind of interaction and the kind of constraints that we talked very briefly this session, the kind of constraints that it imposes, and basically starts to guide the system dynamics. Yes, we will talk about this, but not specifically under the complexity modules. I think because there is a reason for it. Because when we are talking about complexity phenomena, as we talked about, there is no such thing as a complexity phenomena as this unified global complexity. So we need to kind of fine-grain the discussion a little bit, bring it to that computational level, so we will be able to have a kind of a fine-grained understanding of how this works really, rather than just kind of like at the kind of a microscopic complex phenomena talk about this adaptation and contingent, basically positionings.
Cool.
By the way, I'm not. I mean, this is one that I ask. How many of you have read Kant and Hegel? I mean, yes. Okay.
I'm really behind with that. Every time I read Hegel, I just think it's so racist. I just can't even take it.
Well, hey, yes, no, I understand this. Well, Germans, that's the problem with Germans. But yes, but I think we can actually, I think his racism is when you really look at, for example, phenomenology of the spirit, as in contrast to the more explicitly political stuff. Which he talks about the nation state, and it really puts out his religious dogmas out there, is that so many of this racism and stuff are essentially like time-driven biases. They shouldn't be taken that much seriously. In fact, I think you can extract the main core of the Hegelian system from some of these racist agendas. But I would say that it is very difficult to rescue Hegelian system in its entirety from his religious doctrines. A good book, if you want to read Kant and Hegel, and if you find it very difficult, because they are very difficult, regardless of what background you are, and for the most like Kant and Hegel geeks, even these books are very difficult. A very good, accessible book to pre-Kantian themes, Kant and Hegel, is a book written by J. Rosenberg, simply called Accessing Kant. Hegel, what is that thing? Hegel. I can't read it.
Oh, what I typed? It's unrelated to.
Oh no, there is. I can see another book. Is what's that? Hegel. Okay. Okay. I don't know about this book.
Oh, this is a recommendation for Jessica specifically.
Oh, okay.
It's off topic from this, but on the topic of race. So.
Okay.
I typed it.
Are you talking about this one?
Yes, that one. That one.
This is about. I haven't read it yet, but it's about universality and universalism in general.
Okay, excellent. Okay, can you type it in the comment box?
And it's by a Hegelian scholar called Susan Buck-Morse.
Okay.
I think it's the one you mentioned, Aaron, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
No, I just bought it. She's really interesting.
Yeah, I like her a lot as well.
J. Rosenberg is called Accessing Kant. And J. Rosenberg is a monumental philosopher, one of the most criminally undervalued, obscure philosophers. He was a student of Sellars, and he is really systematically unraveled Kant and Hegel, really makes them comprehensible, and really makes them distinguish why they are such important philosophers, and why basically all of this stuff that we're talking about have been already been implied by Kant and Hegel. Possible pitfalls, possible, points of development. But most importantly, when we're talking about, AI and constructing human-level AI, it's basically the stuff that, for example, people like more RL and, good AGI experts talk about are essentially Kantian programs.
Admin question. Are the slides anywhere uploaded yet? Tony and or Reza?
Oh no, I had a bit of a catastrophe. I have this apparently very automatic, well-formed system of archiving, but for one reason, I saved this new slides on my previous slides. So what I need to get from Tony the password to my presentations and back sessions, and then I know how to rewrite them. It's not that much work, and then as soon as I do that, I will upload them. Sorry, yes, it happens all the time with my writings. I save versions on previous versions, and I lose massive amount of work all the time.
Source control.
Okay, I can do that. I'll email it to you, Reza.
Okay, excellent. So, guys, if you don't have any question, I will let you go, and so I can have my lunch finally.
Thanks, Reza.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.